I'm John Borelli. Welcome to Georgetown University. I serve President DeGioia of the university as his special assistant for interreligious initiatives. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the university to this conversation and to welcome all the participants this week, especially those from the Center for Global Education, the Institute for Global Engagement. Welcome to our university. We like to believe that Georgetown University is a place where interreligious dialogue takes place. And it's a serious commitment that we have made as a university in the Catholic and Jesuit tradition. Religious freedom is one of those really hot issues. And Christian-Muslim relations have indeed taken place in several political contexts down through the centuries. I recall the first line of the second paragraph of the groundbreaking document of the Catholic Church, Nostra Aetate, the section on Muslims. It begins, over the centuries, not a few quarrels and misunderstandings have taken place between Christians and Muslims. I believe that's probably the greatest understatement of Vatican II, but not a few. It's a positive way of saying it, I believe. But then it calls on all people of goodwill to come together in conversation. And one of the reasons is for the sake of religious liberty. The unit of the Catholic Church that prepared the document on interreligious dialogue also prepared the documents on religious liberty, the same unit. And so one group was talking about dialogue which leads to spiritual companionship and mutuality, while another group were talking about dialogue and the public square and public issues, the fast and quick kind of dialogue that coalitions are made of, that get a lot of things done in our society and bring freedom to many peoples. So we have two halves, two sides of the coin of interreligious dialogue. And I say this knowing full well that I'm a member of a church which up through the mid-20th century, at least some officials of that church were espousing the doctrine, error has no rights. And that greatly changed. We welcome 4 panelists that we have today. Each of them will be giving a 10-minute initial statement, and then we'll open it up to questions and conversation. So let me introduce all 4 of them in the beginning, and then we'll just proceed in the order in which they are listed. We didn't check that out beforehand. We were just meeting each other as we were calling the session to order. Suhail A is a senior fellow for Christian-Muslim understanding at the Institute for Global Engagement. He's a Washington, D.C. attorney. He has held several posts with the federal government, and you can read those in the bio. He's also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that he is affiliated with the Buxton Initiative as a member of the advisory board. Very briefly, Timothy Shah is an award-winning political scientist and expert on religion and politics. He's a senior fellow in religion and world affairs at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, and an adjunct senior fellow for religion and public policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Knox Thames is a co-author of a forthcoming book, International Religious Freedom Advocacy, a guide to organizations, law, and NGOs. He studied here at Georgetown University as an undergraduate. He earned a Juris Doctorate with honors from American University, Washington College of Law, and was named in Who's Who among American law students. He also holds Master of Arts in International Affairs from the School of International Services at American University. And finally, our 4th panelist today is Ahmed Younis, who is a senior consultant for Gallup and senior analyst for the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies and the Muslim West Facts Initiatives. He's author of American Muslim Voir Dire, Speak the Truth, a post-September 11th look at the reality and debate surrounding American Muslims in this country. And I would say this, as several others have said, these 3 or 4 lines on each is sufficient for this afternoon, but they, of course, have accumulated far more merit than those 3 lines say. So we welcome the 4 of them. We look forward to your conversation. Let us begin then with Suhail Khan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope, and I'm sure this panel will be very interesting despite the burrito stares that folks might have from lunch, but we'll try and make it a little conversational, so I'll try to be brief. But the topic of religious freedom is a very interesting one, and I was just discussing the issue briefly with one of our participants, and how I kind of came to be involved with the issue and how I came to join the IGE team as a senior fellow and to work with the great organization there. And so I thought I might start from the very beginning, as it were. My father, both my parents are immigrated from southern India and Madras, India. My father in 1964 was a third child of a large family of about 6 children. His parents hadn't finished high school. His older siblings hadn't finished high school. They were, when they turned about 13 or 14, were expected to go and work. And I think it's a little different from the narrative that most people understand now of South Asians. But then there was, at least in his family, there wasn't an emphasis on education. There was an emphasis on supporting the family, on working, and being productive, really with one's hands in order to support a very poor and growing family. But my father, being the middle child, kind of the Jan Brady, as it were, of the family, kind of bucked the system and decided he wanted to finish high school. And his father was very disappointed. I know this sounds kind of backwards, but this was the reality in the early 60s, at least for my father. And luckily his mother supported him and said, you know, if you want to do this, we'll support you, and you don't have to go and work, and you can finish high school. Well, being the ungrateful middle child that he was, after finishing high school, he wanted to go to college. And there it became a very tense issue, and at that point it was, if you can, you know, we're not going to support you, and if there's something you want to do, you're doing it on your own. So long story short, he got a scholarship and studied and got his bachelor's, and of course, he wanted to get his master's and PhD, and that meant he had to leave his home. And he took an exam in India that was for a scholarship for the Soviet Union to study physics, nuclear physics, which then was a very sexy issue, at the University of Moscow. And there was only to be one scholarship winner for this exam. So he scraped the train ticket and studied, and he was awarded, took the exam and was awarded the one scholarship for the whole nation of India. If you remember, during the Cold War, India was a non-aligned country, but really they were closer to China and the Soviet Union. And he was, of course, excited. I mean, this is the equivalent of winning the lottery for you and me. And of course, that's when his, you know, he was surprised. That's when his father, my grandfather, put his foot down and said, as my son, I looked the other way when you wanted to, you know, pursue this frivolity of education. But if you are leaving the home and leaving our family for this, you are not going to an atheist, communist country to do this, and I have to forbid you. And of course, as you know, family is very important in many cultures, including in South Asian and particularly in Muslim culture, and so my father acquiesced. The following year, through the blessings of God and his own divine hand, he got a scholarship from that other powerhouse for nuclear physics, the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And then my grandfather said, I give you my blessing that you can go to the United States, that this uneducated, my grandfather's uneducated person, he knew enough about the United States that he said that this is a God-fearing Christian country. And you as a devout Muslim, I give you my blessing that they do respect and they do love and revere God, and so I'll allow you to travel to come to this country. And the story kind of goes from there. My mother immigrated to Colorado. Like a lot of people at University of Wyoming, they eventually transferred to University of Colorado. And he met my mom and married my mother there, and lo and behold, in student housing, they had this kid. I'm the oldest of 5. But I wanted to relate that story because we live in a very different time now. And, here was this person who, he was a tobacconist. My grandfather was a tobacconist, and he had no formal education, but he knew enough about the United States and our tradition. Now, he didn't know a lot about the framers, if anything, about the framers and our tradition of the Establishment Clause and not having an established faith in our Constitution, and how revolutionary that was for our framers to sit down when they did and to not have an established church. The world had never had an experience where there wasn't a national faith, where there was not an established church. And beyond that, he didn't know that we had a First Amendment that not only guaranteed a right to free speech, but particularly guaranteed a right to religion, the right to have and to practice one's faith without intrusion from the government. But he knew enough that the United States government and the founders and the practice of the American government and the people, more importantly, was of one of faithful people that were reverent towards an almighty God. It may not be the exact same tradition as a Muslim, but it was enough to give my grandfather enough comfort that he would allow his child to travel halfway around the globe. And that's a different experience for many. I understand, but it's not that different in that even now, I see the Schmidts here, and Jennifer brought it up. We were on a trip to Syria just a couple months ago with the IGE, and one of our delegates is a very devout evangelical philanthropist, and he took it upon himself one evening after we were all back at the hotel to kind of wander the streets of Damascus, and walked into one of the many coffee shops, and there he struck up a conversation with some of the local Damascus residents, and he said there was an older Syrian gentleman, and when it became clear that our friend was an American, he reached into his suit pocket and fished out a very tattered copy of the Gettysburg Address. And so you cannot underestimate the power of ideas. You cannot underestimate the experience that others have of the American experience, despite how remote that may seem. But that was the upbringing I had. For me, as somebody born in Colorado, raised in California, was one of reverence for the United States, appreciation for this country, appreciation not only for the freedoms that we enjoy, but for the cherished liberty that we enjoy as people of faith, regardless of our faith tradition, to enjoy religious freedom here as Americans. And my parents were very much reverent of that, and instilled in all of their children that same reverence. Indeed, when it came time for me, again, my parents always joked that I was the kid they experimented on, being the oldest. When it came time for me to go to school, they sent me to a Catholic school because they felt that that would be the best for their child, to go to a school where there was an overt recognition of faith, and where we had to wear uniforms. And Paul is probably smiling, but we had to wear uniforms and go to Mass and learn the catechism before we learned anything else, etc. But that was, again, something that my parents felt was very important for their children as Muslims to experience and to enjoy. So you can imagine that was the experience I had, and it was a positive and healthy one. And then you had some concerns about being Muslim by non-Muslims in society, but they were more out of curiosity. But you can imagine the full body tackle or the sucker punch that was 9/11. And I want to be brief, and so I'll come to a quick conclusion. But I was working in the administration then. It was like any other morning. It was a beautiful day. Actually, as a happenstance, and this story hasn't been told, but I was preparing a memo for the president to meet with major Muslim leaders that afternoon at 3 o'clock. And I was scrambling to get the memo completed so that when he was coming back from his visit to the school in Florida that has now become infamous, that he would have enough time to read through the memo, to meet with major American Muslim faith leaders that afternoon in the Oval Office and in the Roosevelt Room. And of course, we had the alarm sound, and I thought actually it was a false alarm, so I was one of the last to evacuate the building. But that was when you had the outpouring, of course, and we all experienced that, of animosity, of misunderstanding, etc., of Islam and what Islam meant. And and there you had instances of hate on all sides. Of course, 9/11 itself, the attack was an act of hate in of itself. But you had also the retaliatory expressions from so many in our country. But I have to tell you that even despite that, there were so many positive expressions of love, of understanding from fellow Americans, particularly from the faith community. And there were attacks on me as being one of the Muslims working in the White House, and there were attempts to try and have me removed, that I was a security risk, that you could not have Muslims serving in the federal government, that unless they took, and there are some today that still say, unless you take a special loyalty oath, Muslims should not serve in the military, should not serve in the federal government. But it was people of faith particularly who came to my defense, particularly in the Christian, particularly in the evangelical community, to say, no, this is not right. Now, I'll end on a note that is, I'm often asked if that is the experience you have, Suhail, of religious freedom here in the American context, that you are able to practice your faith, that as a Capitol Hill staffers, we were able to establish the Friday prayers in the Capitol that still continue to this day through 3 different speakers, that we have a Friday prayer in the dome of the Capitol, a Muslim prayer. And yet, what about the experience of many Christians in Muslim countries? And I'll end by saying that is something that we need to push and need to change. There is a context for that. There is a colonial context. You know, we're in Georgetown. I'm a transportation person, but as one of my hats I wear, you always wonder, why does the metro come to Georgetown? Well, there's a reason for that, and we can talk about that. But there's a reason why in some countries, some Muslim countries, proselytization, the preaching of the gospel is forbidden, and indeed some converts are handed down harsh sentences, and that's something we should talk about. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's Islamic per se, but there are contexts, there are reasons for that, and we inherit the world as it is. But in doing so, we need to change that, and I think there are respectful and constructive ways of doing that. We can work together as people of faith to do that. But I did want to address that because that is a concern of mine and, of course, a concern for many. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suhail. To Suhail's left, Timothy Shah. Oh, I'm sorry. Timothy, you moved around. I'm sorry.
My mom, I used to be called Timothy, and then I converted.
Oh, okay. You want me to go?
Yeah,
okay, all right, yeah.
To my right, Timothy Shah.
Okay, yes, sir. Thanks very much.
I forgot about the conversion.
Well, let me first congratulate the organizers of this conference and this panel for being wise enough to have 2 Indian Americans on the panel. I'm very grateful and honored to be sitting alongside Suhail Khan, whose father arrived in the United States from India 3 years before my father arrived in the United States from India. So it's great to hear Suhail, particularly because of the content of what he said, which I appreciated very much. And some of what I'll be emphasizing, in fact, most of what I'll be emphasizing really relates directly to the last point that Suhail Khan made concerning the situation for Christians in Muslim-majority countries. This conference is billed as an honest conversation between evangelicals and Muslims, and I applaud the organizers not only for having 2 Indians on this panel, but also for creating a context for an honest conversation between evangelicals and Muslims. And so let's have an honest conversation about religious freedom with respect to evangelicals and Muslims. I'd like to push that conversation forward. I'd like to push it honestly. I don't presume to speak to Muslims about what they should think or what they do think. I'm an evangelical Christian. I'll speak forthrightly and without apology about what I think as an evangelical Christian. about the situation with respect to religious freedom in the world, and particularly in Muslim-majority countries. Because, and this is again to applaud the organizers of the conference, it's impossible to have an honest conversation between evangelicals and Muslims about the relationship between these two very dynamic, globally important religious communities without addressing the issue of religious freedom. And so it's very good and important that we are doing that. And again, I want to address this issue as an evangelical Christian. Personally, I will confess from the start that my perspective is not limited, which is why we need to have a conversation. I invite Muslims or others who may disagree with what I say to say so, so we can have an honest conversation. And I'd like specifically to say three things. First, I'd like to talk about the contributions of evangelicals specifically to religious freedom, both historically, theologically, and in the contemporary world. Second, I'd like to talk about the concerns that evangelical Christians have about the state of religious freedom in the world today, particularly in Muslim-majority countries. And third, I'd like to talk about questions that evangelical Christians have about the state of religious freedom, again, particularly in Muslim-majority countries. But first, I'd like to say something about what is an evangelical. We've heard a little bit, not very much today, but we've heard a little bit about evangelicals. Well, what are evangelicals? So let's start with that. Evangelicals can be defined in lots of different ways, and no one definition is authoritative, because there's no evangelical pope or evangelical church to tell evangelicals what they should think about anything. But there are, I think, generally speaking, three common characteristics of evangelical Christians. One is that they believe the Bible. The Bible has a central place in the theology and the authority structure of evangelical belief. Evangelicals believe in a high view of the authority of the Bible. Second, evangelicals believe that it is necessary in order to have a vital, saving relationship with God to be born again. Which depends on believing that Jesus Christ took on the sins of the world on the cross, suffered and died for my sins and yours, and rose again. And that when we believe that, when we believe in Jesus, when we throw ourselves at the mercy of God as expressed in Jesus Christ, we experience a personal born again experience. We are born again spiritually, and that this is something that one can't be born into. You can't be born a Christian. You can't inherit Christianity from your parents. You can't inherit or receive Christianity from your government. No one can save you for you. That you need to choose. You need to make a personal choice, personal faith commitment. This is an essential aspect of evangelical Christianity, generally speaking. Third, evangelicals believe in broadcasting this good news, which we believe is good news, that human beings don't have to work off the consequences of their sin, don't have to take the punishment for their sin themselves, but that human beings have been saved by the sacrifice of Jesus, that this good news is something that evangelicals believe that it's incumbent on them to broadcast to the world, that it's incumbent on us to share this verbally, it's incumbent on us to share it by the way we behave, it's incumbent on us to do works and to serve the world in a way that bears witness to the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and the love of God that he has expressed for us in Jesus. So believe the Bible, be born again, and broadcast the good news. Those are the hallmarks of evangelical Christianity. Well, so let's talk then about what evangelicals would, and many evangelicals, I certainly can't say I speak for all evangelicals, but I've talked to many evangelicals in many parts of the world about their perspectives on religious freedom, around the world. I've been involved in a large research project on evangelical political activism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I've lived, at least for short periods, in a couple of Muslim countries. I've talked to evangelicals who work in Muslim countries. My brother-in-law is married to a Pakistani Christian who is actively involved in sharing the Christian message in Muslim countries, including countries like Pakistan and other countries. She's someone whose name I cannot mention because it would endanger her personal safety if I were to talk about her and the work that she does and the organization that she works for. So again, I don't want to say I speak on behalf of all evangelicals, but I think I have some awareness of what a number of evangelicals feel and think about religious freedom today. First, I want to talk about evangelical contributions. I think evangelicals, because of what I just said is the essential set of characteristics that define evangelicals, evangelicals tend to have a very personal and individual and voluntaristic conception of faith. And historically speaking, I don't want to provide a long historical lecture, but historically speaking, this evangelical emphasis on the necessity of personal decision has had a massive impact on the politics, the culture, the history of the West. Christianity in general, over history, has not been particularly interested in religious freedom, as Professor Borelli just alluded to. But the main kind of vanguard that pushed religious freedom, first in Britain, and then in the colonies, and then in the new United States, was a range of evangelical groups. Baptists, Methodists, dissenting Protestants, people who believed that you couldn't be coerced into the Christian faith, you couldn't inherit your Christianity from your church, but you had to be free to make your own decision for Christianity. And these dissenting Protestants, people like John Bunyan in Britain, dissenting evangelical Protestants in the United States, worked to establish a system in the United States that, as Suhail very eloquently said, was absolutely unique, and in some respects remains absolutely unique in the world. An entirely voluntaristic religious free market where the government doesn't get behind any particular faith, doesn't say that one faith is better than others, but allows people to make their own choice. And historically speaking, if you look at the historical record, there were certainly people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who were not evangelical Christians who advocated the non-establishment of religion, but it's very unlikely that they would have been successful but for the influence of evangelical groups, who were, as it were, the political stormtroopers that enabled the political pressure to be brought in states like Virginia, which had established churches, and which helped to give us a free market in religion. And evangelicals, in many, many ways, remain on the vanguard of promoting religious freedom around the world, not just for themselves, but for Muslims and others. And I'll just give you one example. As an evangelical Christian, I've been very personally concerned about the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. Hindu nationalism is a movement that has victimized both Christians and Muslims in India. And I have been among those who've consistently sought to secure greater religious freedom in India, to protect both the rights of Muslims and the rights of Christians. I was among those who applauded the United States government's decision to not allow Narendra Modi, the chief minister of Gujarat, to receive a visa to come visit the United States. He still does not have a visa to come to the United States. And evangelicals, in many, many respects, have worked to defend religious freedom, not just for themselves, but for others. So those are the contributions that evangelicals have made to religious freedom. Second, the concerns that evangelicals have about the state of religious freedom. I'm not going to go into great detail. I think it's almost too well known by people in this room that in many Muslim-majority countries there is a serious problem with respect to religious freedom. The State Department, as many of you know, lists every year countries of particular concern where there are particularly egregious violations of religious freedom. This year, the State Department named 8 countries as countries of particular concern. 4 of the 8 countries are Muslim-majority countries. The U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom has also named its own countries of particular concern. 13 countries it named recently. 8 out of the 13 are Muslim-majority countries. It also announced a list of countries to be watched, a watch list of countries. 11 countries were named. 6 of the 11 countries on the watch list are Muslim-majority countries. Now, I should hasten to add, and I fully understand, that Islam as a religion should not be blamed necessarily for the political practices of all of those countries, Muslim-majority countries, where there are very serious violations of religious freedom. I should also emphasize, and I want to say this very clearly, the primary victims of religious persecution in Muslim-majority countries are Muslims, not minority groups, but Muslims. Muslims are not given the chance to choose their own version of the faith. Muslims are not given the chance to decide what brand of Islam they want to believe in. In many instances, they have to accept the version of Islam that the government insists they should have. The situation for various Muslim sects like the Ahmadi sect, some Shia groups in some countries is very widely known. I've met leaders of the Ahmadi sect in Bangladesh, for example, a group that has been woefully oppressed and victimized throughout the Muslim world. So the first victims of this situation in many, many Muslim countries are Muslims. But it's also true that people who convert from Islam to Christianity are being victimized, even in so-called relatively moderate Muslim countries like Malaysia. It is illegal for Malays to be evangelized in Malaysia. It's extremely difficult, if not legally impossible, for Malays to convert from Islam to Christianity. Malaysia is not one of the countries that is most egregiously violating religious freedom. So the situation is extremely serious indeed. Let me just finish by asking some questions about religious freedom in the Muslim world. I think it's important for evangelicals, if they're honest, to ask their Muslim friends, what can we do together to change the situation? There are many groups working for human rights and democracy in the Muslim world. There are many groups that are pushing for elections in the Muslim world. There are many groups that are promoting the rights of women in the Muslim world. But I would like to ask, should there not be more groups, Muslim groups, that are working to stand up for the rights of religious minorities in the Muslim world? And are there ways that evangelicals and Muslims can work together to advance religious freedom in the Muslim world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Knox Thames, you're to the right here. On the panel, anyway. We'll find out in a minute.
Is that a political statement? Or? Well, I too would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today, and it's a real honor to participate in this conversation. And I have to say it's intimidating as well because of the various panels. I think this is the most difficult topic to talk about. The other panels were more aspirational, big picture, but when you get to religious freedom and proselytism, it's the nitty-gritty, it's the personal, it's your neighborhood level. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. First, a caveat. I am the Director of Policy at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is an official U.S. government commission that monitors religious freedom worldwide and makes recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and the Congress. The comments I'm giving today are in my personal capacity and are not those of the commission. Another caveat, since we're here as I'm representing the evangelical world, I did not attend Georgetown University, but rather Georgetown College, which is a small Baptist college in central Kentucky. So I just want to point that out. Although having lived in Washington for more than 10 years, the confusion is often useful when you're trying to network because it's such a small school. So. The first thing I'd like just to sort of set the framework for what are the international standards for religious freedom and also for changing one's faith. The 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 18 says very clearly that everyone has the freedom to change their religion, as well as provides the freedom for individuals and communities to meet and for worship and to educate on their faith. That was reinforced when the Declaration, which was a non-binding aspirational document, was made binding through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in the mid-60s through Article 18. And the language changed a little bit, but it guarantees the right of all individuals to have or adopt the religion of their choice. Other international conventions have come alongside this. The European Convention on Human Rights, Article 9, gives the right of all individuals to change their faith. The Organization of American States and the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the religious freedom language actually says it twice, that there's the right to change faith. The politically binding commitments of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which covers Europe and Eurasia, also promises and guarantees the right to change faith. Interestingly, the African Union human rights document doesn't speak to the issue. And I think this is where you start to see how the different compositions of the bodies have an impact on the rights that are given, since the African Union does include the North African countries where issues of changing faith are a concern. I would also just like to touch briefly about U.S. policy towards international religious freedom. Evangelicals, but other Christian communities and other faiths were very involved in 1998 in establishing and seeing passed by the Congress and signed by President Clinton of the International Religious Freedom Act. And it was really a groundbreaking piece of legislation that established a variety of mechanisms within the U.S. government to promote religious freedom internationally. And that was part of a reflection of the traditional commitment to religious liberty of the United States. It established in the State Department the Office of International Religious Freedom, which is headed by an ambassador at large, which is a high-ranking State Department official. And I see my former colleague Al Gambas from that office is here. It also established the commission where I work, which serves as somewhat of a watchdog to see how the State Department is implementing U.S. policy towards religious freedom, but to also make policy recommendations on ways to improve religious freedoms for all. And I think that's an important thing to point out. While there are many Christian groups promoting and pushing IRFA, as it's known, it's about religious freedom for all. And in the almost 10 years I've been in the religious freedom field, I have probably done more work on behalf of non-Christians than I have for persons of my own faith. And I think Tim is right to point out that in many of these Muslim countries, it's Muslims that have the greatest religious freedom problems. Although the religious freedom limitations on minorities are very severe, just numerically, it's often Muslims that have experienced the greatest limitations. And lastly, I guess I just, on a personal note, explain my motivation as an evangelical Christian for doing this work. It comes out of sort of my understanding of the Bible, God's call that Christians be engaged in issues of justice. It comes out in Isaiah 1:17, where we're exhorted to seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. And then also in the New Testament, in Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where a lawyer was quizzing Jesus about, how does one get eternal life? And he sort of turns the question back on him and what is asked. And he said, well, the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, that's correct. And then these lawyers, asked another question and said, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus then told the story of the Good Samaritan, which we all know, but there was a person who'd been attacked by robbers, left on the side of the road. It's presumed to be a Jew. 3 other members of his community passed by, but it was the Samaritan who was not part of that community. In fact, historically, there was a lot of animosity between Samaritans and Jews, but he decided to help the other. And that was the answer to who is your neighbor? Well, it's not necessarily your community, but it's another person. And so I've found that instructive as to how I think Christians should be engaged in acts in all forms of human rights work. And I've just, as my career's unfolded, found my way into the religious freedom world. But one thing, I guess just to explain the motivation of evangelicals, Tim did a great job of highlighting the three B's of why we do these things, why we're involved in proselytization. But there's always been the example given, I remember growing up in church, about if you had the cure for cancer and you didn't tell anyone about it, that would be a bad thing. And evangelicals believe we've had an experience that's changed our lives, that's going to give us the promise of everlasting life. And we want to share that with others because it's remarkable. It's good news. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation about how that impacts societies that aren't Christian, and the impact on families. But the intent is not to destroy families or to create fissures in society. It's actually just to share this experience that we've had that has changed our lives, and out of our love for others that we're taught to have, we want others to have that experience as well. So with that, I'll end and look forward to the conversation.
Good. Thank you very much. So, Ahmed Timothy Younis, right?
Younis. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most beneficent, most merciful. You know, you try to run away from running a Muslim organization to the Gallup organization so you're not put in the situation of defending Muslims in these conversations. And here I am at the end of a very rich day, finding myself absolutely forced to respond to these very eloquent challenges and throwing my career to the wayside. It's a good thing Dahlia left already. You know, I want to directly respond to these two issues of reciprocity in the situation or experience of Muslims in the West vis-a-vis Christians in Muslim lands, and I want to address this issue of proselytization. And I do it for the folks from other faiths who are in this room. They know that I do it with great love and great respect and a great amount of humility in this gathering of people that have done great things. I think it's quite incongruent to establish the narrative Muslims in the West have the freedom to practice their religion, no problem, but Christians in Muslim lands are oppressed and forced into some sort of a, restricted religious experience. And what's up with you Western Muslims? What are you doing about it? That renders the Muslim that you're engaging defined in a monolith, not as a Westerner, but as something called Muslim. And therefore they have some responsibility just because they're Muslim for what Muslim majority societies are doing to non-Muslims in their societies because of their identity non-Muslim. And that's, I think, the first point of departure for a conversation between evangelicals who are necessarily American in their identity, American in their philosophy, American in their worldview globally, and Muslims. And the primary component of Muslim communities that you will necessarily interact with are Western Muslims. For example, are American Muslims for an American evangelical experience. And for American Muslims or Western Muslims, there is a laundry list of challenges to their ability to freely practice their religion, be it by law or by custom, to their ability to fully integrate into Western society, be it by law or by custom, that they would love to embark upon that conversation. It's a conversation that says, for example, according to our polling in Europe, that 53% of the British public believe that a Muslim woman must remove her face veil as a prerequisite to integration into society. Only 12% of Muslims agree with them, British Muslims. Or a conversation in the United States of America that Delia alluded to earlier, where there is a direct correlation between where you are going to worship and what you think about Islam and Muslims. So to juxtapose Muslim majority lands and the experience of non-Muslims there against the experience of Muslims in Western lands as though the West is non-Muslim by nature and identity is a fallacy. America is not Christendom. America is America. We all went to law school. Maybe one person didn't go to, we all went to law school. Right? America is America. And if we are to define America and measure America and the American experience of minorities according to any standard, it should be the standard of America, not the standard or the narrative of a Christian land, a Christian majority that is yielding equality to a group that defines themselves as a minority. And I think that's a very important conversation as it relates to this reciprocity conversation. Yeah, you guys are doing great in America. How come nobody's doing great where you're from? Well, I'm from America. And that's a fundamental shift that we have to take in the discourse. On this issue of proselytization, and I totally threw my whole talk out, and I'm just going to address these two issues, and then let's have a conversation. If to proselytize, let me take a step back. If to freely practice your religion, you are saying that you want Muslim majority societies to open the door and create permits and give you seals of approval to take your religion and spread it amongst its people and change its demographics and change their identity that has been ingrained in that land for hundreds of years, then we are discussing politics and sociology, not religion. When I was in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, when you look at the realities that people are living, you go to Osh, Kyrgyzstan, in the south, and there are two influencing components within society that are attempting to get to the Muslim mind. The American evangelical Christian with dollars, and Hizb ut-Tahrir as a political movement that believes in the creation of a caliphate. It's a free market. The American evangelical comes to the Muslim family, and Hizb ut-Tahrir comes to the Muslim family. You need money, I have money, let's move together. One caveat, you identify with us. When as a Muslim, when I see that narrative happening, my concern is not that these people will become Christians and move with the Christians. My concern is that they will choose Hizb ut-Tahrir because it is affiliated with Islam in one way or another. That's just one political reality where the presence of evangelism pushes people towards a team they otherwise might not choose if that evangelical Christian influence didn't exist. You have to be getting upset with me. That's the whole point of this. That's the whole point. That's the whole point, right? That's one example. Another example, I was sitting with the nuncio, the representative of the Pope in Cairo, and I was just asking the guy, what's your relationship with Sheikh Ali Goma? Sheikh Ali Goma, the Mufti, it's wonderful. I mean, wonderful. We have dinners together, we go fishing together, we go on vacation together. What's your relationship with Baba Shnoda, the head of the Egyptian Coptic church, the head of the whole Christian experience in that country? Zero relationship. Why? Well, because they see us as the West. They don't see me as, there are Egyptian Catholics, they don't see me as an organic part of this discourse called Christianity in this part of the world. Gallup data shows no distinction on acute conflict political issues in the opinion of the Arab people based on their Christian or Muslim identities. They have the same perspectives. The same perspectives on the West, the same perspectives on Israel, the same perspectives all the way across. So for an American evangelical narrative, there has to be a point at which you realize this is also about identity. This is about whiteness and Americanness and entering lands that have not seen that experience before. I tell you this because I love you. But this is a part of the conversation. I'm a kid from Los Angeles. I happen to live in Doha, Qatar, trying to create jobs for Arab youth, Christian and Muslim. But this is a conversation that must be had in your communities. If you're to embark upon one of these experiences that you're speaking of, there are so many amazing things that Christian Americans are doing all over the world. But how do we define those experiences? And what is the responsibility of Muslims to engage? I mean, I'd like to just directly answer the question, what can we do together? A whole lot. Is one of them allowing American evangelical Christians to be a part of discourse that relates to elections in Muslim majority societies? No. It should not. Just like American Muslim narratives shouldn't inject themselves into political experiences in Muslim majority societies that are not American societies. This is not our place. This is the place of the people of that land. They determine and decipher that conversation. How many hundreds of years does evangelical Christian Arab identity, how many hundreds of years has that identity existed? Evangelical Arab Christian identity. Not that long. Certainly not as long as Baba Shnoda. Certainly not as long as the Catholics of Lebanon. This is a part of the discourse. It's a part of the conversation that needs to be had on women's issues. Muslim women polled by Gallup all over the world make it very clear. They see change in the status of women as necessary for progress. But they see the catalysts for that change being women from their countries and the Muslim leadership of their societies. They do not see that as coming from the West. That's what the data speaks to. Stand up for religious minorities. Who? Who? Is it the responsibility of Muslim majority societies and people of influence in those societies to stand up for the religious freedom of Egyptian Christians? Yes. Is it their job to stand up for the religious freedom of somebody that's coming through an embassy or somebody that's coming through a school and is engaging in illegal proselytization and the creation of house churches on the weekend? No. These are realities that we have to speak to each other. I'll end on this, and this is something that Chris Saipo has heard me say many times because it's so central to why I live and do what I do, and it's so important. You know, when the U.S. created a constitution, there was a discussion in newspapers in New York about whether that constitution should be created, and that discussion was culminated into what's called the Federalist Papers. And in the first paragraph of the first Federalist, Alexander Hamilton says, "It seems to have been left to the people of this nation by their conduct and example to determine the question whether man will forever be destined to be ruled by fear and force, or whether we can build a constitution, a way of life that is sourced in reflection and choice." That is in my opinion, that's the mission statement of this great land, of its constitution, of its minority communities and majority communities, to yield to the people of this nation and the people of the world a life that is based on reflection and choice, not fear and force. That definitely applies to the conversation about religious freedom for non-Muslims in Muslim-majority societies. But once we inject the changing of demographics and political discourse into that reality, into that principle, a new conversation arises. Proselytization is not allowed in Israel. It's also not allowed in many countries in the Gulf. The reason for that has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with socioeconomics and politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. We have had 4 stirring presentations. There's a microphone set up here in the main aisle, so if you would line up there and please ask your questions.
I don't remember who said you had to have courage to step up here, so I'd be happy to inject into the dialogue a little bit. No, I'm at the Rivendell Institute and also at Yale University. My name is Don Smedley. If I could get your comments on 2 thoughts. One, these arose out of the workshop last year at Yale on a common word. One reflects on the Muslim side and the other one on the Christian side. On the Christian side, asking us to take a step backwards, one of the things I walked away from was an analogy that came to me while I was talking to Dr. Godless at the University of Georgia, and that was this. If American evangelicals were to transpose themselves, say, into a country the size of Jordan, and we had all the values and freedoms that we have as Americans here today, and the country the size of the United States would be like Jordan or Lebanon or another Muslim country, and they wanted to send as many Muslim missionaries over to our country as they possibly could in order to bring the Muslim faith, we would probably at one level want to say, that's a great idea. We believe in religious freedom. We want you to come and send as many people as you can. But the reality of it probably would be we would take a serious step back and wonder if that was a really great idea. For many of the socio and economic reasons that Dr. Younis brought up, which was a point that was raised at Yale, which I think is a really valid one. It doesn't mean, I'm not agreeing that they shouldn't be able to send people, or that we shouldn't, and that this is an important dialogue. It's a reflective point just for us to take a step back and just think about sometimes what we're asking. On the other side of the coin, a question I asked one of the Muslim scholars at that particular session was, they were arguing about the importance of religious freedom, or the lack of it in the United States, for civil liberties among Muslims in the U.S. And the argument was on religious freedom lines. So my question was, and this is to you as well, was that argument based on the belief that the United States and its values in this area were not being lived up to in our own country, which would be one argument, or was it because there is a universal value of human rights about religious freedom? And if that's the case, then it should be practiced everywhere as well. She didn't answer the question. In other words, if it's the former, then it seems like there's no dialogue at one level because it's just about what we do or what you do, and so there's no place for a discussion. On the other hand, if it's about a universal human right about religious freedom, then these issues that come into the political and social are important and also must be grappled with in order to cut through these issues. Okay. I'll let you comment. Thanks.
All right. Comment. Timothy.
Yes. Well, forgive me, but I think that now in a couple of different interventions, the intervention by Ahmed and the intervention by Don Smedley, there's been a totally fallacious identification of America with evangelical Christianity. Nothing in my remarks said anything about identifying America with evangelical Christianity. My interest in advancing religious freedom in other countries has nothing to do with my wanting to impose America or evangelicalism on those countries. It has everything to do with wanting people to have the freedom and the dignity to interact with the truth in the way they choose to, and to respond to the truth in the way they choose to. Most evangelicals in the world are not Americans. Most Americans are not evangelical. American evangelicalism are two different things. So let's please not conflate America with evangelicalism. My interest in promoting religious freedom in Egypt has nothing to do with my interest in getting American missionaries dropped into Egypt. If Egypt decided to have every form of religious freedom that we could imagine, but decided not to issue permits to American missionaries, fine. That would be a massive step forward. So let's all agree that that is not the central issue that I'm talking about, nor is it the central issue that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is talking about, which says nothing about the rights of missionaries. In my country, India, my father's country, India, there are very serious restrictions on missionaries. It's very hard to get a missionary visa to go into India. One can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Personally, I have no objection to it. Most of the people, the evangelicals, sharing their faith in India are not Americans. They're not Europeans, they're not Koreans, they're Indians. Yet there are laws increasingly in place in India that prevent Indians from sharing their faith with other Indians. I think that is wrong. And to the extent that a similar thing happens in Muslim countries, I think it's absolutely wrong.
Just a couple things. And that first, I felt it was important to say this in the beginning. Again, I think there are challenges in many countries, including in Muslim-majority countries, where oftentimes laws that are on the books that limit the ability of the sharing of religion across faiths are there. And again, there are historical reasons for that. You have to realize, just as Ahmed pointed out very eloquently, and that is, there is often a political context for that reality. The apostasy laws, for example. In some countries, there are apostasy laws. If you don't know what those apostasy laws basically prevent somebody from converting, officially at least, from one faith to another, particularly in Muslim-majority countries, for Muslims to become other faiths, Christians in this instance. And those, if you talk to Muslim scholars, generally are based on a very relic-based understanding whereby your faith was part of your national identity. And therefore, when you had, Ahmed mentioned Christendom, when you had a Christian empire, when you had a Muslim empire, to be one or the other of the faith was to, in effect, to change nationalities, to change your national allegiance. Now, is that the case now? No, that isn't. You can be Egyptian and Christian, you can be Muslim and American, and there is no conflict in either. But that is the historical vestige that needs to be dealt with. And so when you're talking about evangelical movements, I'm not talking about American evangelicals, but in evangelical movements today, that's something that has to be recognized. Secondly, you also have to realize that there is a colonial overlay, and that for many countries in the Muslim majority world, in Africa and South Asia in particular, when they think of Christians, they think of the white Europeans, whether it be Dutch or German or British or whomever that came to come and at one hand came to colonize us, on the other hand to convert us from the unwashed faith that we might have practiced before. Now, again, is that the experience today? No, but that is the reality. And the last thing I'll end with, and this is backed up by not only polling from Gallup, but also from a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that is you have to realize that this is coming to an American perspective now, and I'm not saying that all evangelicals are American, but we as Americans are very good at realizing that we're a very diverse community and that we represent very disparate viewpoints. But if you go to Europe and you talk to Europeans, they think that Americans are these loud, brash, militaristic, right-wing, Christian, crazy fanatics that want to spread God and country through the end of a barrel. If you go to Muslim and South Asian countries, they think that we're these godless people who listen to Britney Spears, sorry Britney, and want to spread pornography and godlessness and heedless lifestyles. And that's the baggage. Now, neither narrative is correct, as you know, but both is correct for different parts of our society. And so again, when a Westerner, be they American or otherwise missionary person, comes into a land like that, that's the DNA that you're stepping into. That's the narratives, or the competing narratives that you're stepping into. And that's why you have certain laws on the books in many Muslim majority countries. Now, are they right? No, and that's why I felt it was important to say that from the get-go. But there is something that, we just can't go in there with the flag unfurled and, onward Christian soldiers and think that we should change that right away. When we have the American experience, even though our framers were so wise and so prescient in the way they established our Constitution. Obviously, American Jews, Catholics, and others, Sikhs, Hindus, and now Muslims, have had to struggle to find our space in the American context. And that is a challenge. Now, is the framework there? It is. But it's not like we were ready from the get-go to practice religious freedom for everybody involved.
Maybe we ought to take another question. Yeah, please.
You can address either of these, but the first is Michael Oren wrote a book a few years back about America and the Middle East, and a large section of that was about missionaries in early America. And I find juxtaposing those stories and how their conviction to witness to Middle Eastern peoples to be at a great contrast to somehow power dynamics are leveraged today by certain folks who are witnessing to Muslims in Muslim countries. So I would offer that for consideration in terms of how I differentiate those two. And a question would be about reciprocity again, talking about the U.S. And talking about religious freedom and the reality of it is how might you compare something like the reaction or the headlines when on the New York subway they had 877Y Islam ad buys and the outcry and vitriol that you saw in some of the press as compared to the Archdiocese of Washington putting maybe it's God in the Washington Metro, and the complete lack of outcry by any other religious group as to that, and a question of are we really saying that there's this idea of religious freedom and an unfettered or unafraid expression of Islamic identity in America? Because I would argue, frankly, there's not. And I've been lucky enough to grow up in a relatively safe and nurturing environment for a religious minority identity. But even then, so I offer both of those for your consideration.
I can just quickly respond on the second question. I completely agree that America is not as religiously free as it should be. But I think that structurally and constitutionally, there is at least a basic framework that makes it possible, for example, for Christians to choose to be Muslims. And there is not overwhelming, certainly not only no legal sanction, but in many communities in our country, there is really essentially little cultural sanction if someone chooses to do that. So that's in response to the second question. In response to your first point about missionaries, I know a number of people who are missionaries to the Muslim world. None of them are Americans. My sister-in-law is a Pakistani Christian who is a missionary in the Muslim world. I know how she operates. I know the kinds of things she does, the kinds of conversations she has. She does what she does with extraordinary sensitivity and extraordinary finesse and graciousness. Is that all Muslims, or rather all missionaries in the Muslim world? Of course not. But I think that many of the organizations that are involved in seeking to bring the gospel to Muslim majority countries do so with great sensitivity, do so using Christians from those countries themselves. And this is, again, what I really want to emphasize. I am interested in having all of the religious communities in the countries that we're talking about, including the United States, all of them, be as free as they possibly can be to say whatever they want to say. To say whatever they want to say about their faith, about the faith of other people, short of inciting violence or short of that sort of destructive speech. So I'll leave it at that.
Knox.
To address the reciprocity question, I think that's the wrong way to approach this conversation. You know, I'm a lawyer. I've been following religious freedom through international law for a while now. And so the global community has decided on a set of common standards that everyone is working towards. And I think that's how we should compare the behaviors of each country. You know, the United States sends out lots of missionaries. Saudi Arabia sends out, you know, exports through their petrodollars, things that a form of Islam, not being a Muslim, but I think many Muslims in America would disagree with as an accurate characterization of their faith. You know, one of the largest groups proselytizing in Kyrgyzstan are South Korean missionaries, actually. So I think to have this conversation, we don't get anywhere by saying, well, you do this, you do that, we should move away from it. The question about if we were the size of Jordan and Jordan was the size of the United States, I really get that. I mean, I grew up in a small town in the Bible Belt, and my family and I, we were Presbyterian, and all the four main churches were located on the same four corners of the main crossroads in my hometown, and we decided to become Baptist. And so the parking lots actually were next to each other, so we left, you know, walked across the parking lot and became Baptist. And there were, you know, people, friends of my parents, who wouldn't talk to them anymore because they weren't Presbyterian. So I would disagree a little bit with Tim about the social consequences. I mean, I get that this having, you know, a faith that's not Christian, it would even be a bigger division in a society. But in the 21st century, I don't know what the other options are. I mean, we've got information and ideas freely flowing in ways that's never happened in the history of the world. I mean, looking at Iran, you know, you've got these mass mobilizations through Twitter. I don't even know what Twitter is, but, you know, they're getting 50,000 people in the main square to, you know, for Mousavi. So if these ideas can't be spread, how do we do that? Are you going to pass laws? You're going to, you know, criminalize certain forms of speech? Who determines what's the speech? Who determines what's the right version of the faith? There's a case we've been following at work about an Egyptian convert, Mr. Higazi, who converted to Coptic Orthodox faith 34 years ago, and he just wants to have his ID document reflect that. In Egypt, your identity document either says Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. He wants to go from Muslim to Christian. And a court just decided yesterday that can't do it, that it would cause a public disturbance. Well, that's very concerning and a real limitation on the religious freedoms of all Egyptians. I mean, this has nothing to do with American proselytizing. This is like the most ancient church in the world having a member join, and the government is preventing his ability to make that change. And I think I've just finished reading the book God is Back by the two economist journalists. And they attribute the vitality of American religiosity to the free marketplace, that it provides a place to compete, and the extremes are then pushed to the edges because they're shouted out. And I think in the Muslim world, my opinion would be that if they were to open it up, yes, there would be a period of discord, but I think it would ultimately create a healthier society because they would have an open discourse and government would be out of the business of determining what is and is not a true faith.
Good. Let's take the next question. Okay.
There are so many points that it's so difficult to respond to all of them simultaneously. Okay.
Let's do get some more questions.
It's important to say that just as this specific strand of evangelical, born again as the key word, discourse is excluded from that discourse that you're talking about, Knox, many approaches to Islam and interpretations of the Prophet's experience and the Quran are also excluded in those same arenas. Okay, that's number one. Number two, because the American evangelical approach or infusion of discourse is not accepted in that already going discussion, doesn't mean there isn't a robust discussion that's marginalizing extremists and mainstreaming mainstream thought. I mean, there's more going on in newspapers over there and on TV over there than there is here at home any day. Any day, there's a more robust conversation. There are more perspectives. There is more antagonistic. There is more diversity of opinion than there is here at home on a lot of issues, including religion. So, the guy should be able to say that he's Christian on his ID in Egypt. But that's not the gravamen of what we're discussing. And my last point is, this is probably out of ignorance then. But what is the germination? Where is day one of this phrase, evangelical born again? When in history and where in geography does it exist? Because all of the people that you're talking about who are organic to their societies, at one point or another, interacted with somebody from outside that said, it's a really good idea and a part of our religion that we convert all of the people around us and we bear witness to them. I mean, my mother grew up in Catholic school and all of our family's friends are Christians. There was never a moment at which somebody in our family said, this is a really persuasive argument. I should probably leave Islam and embrace Christianity. This is a specific ideology. Where does this ideology start and what is its connection to the West? That's my question. Because we assume that although less than 20% of Muslims around the world are Arabs, there is a direct connection between a man named the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah from a tribe called Quraysh in the Arabian Peninsula. And that's where this concept, Islam, began.
Sure. A brief response and we'll go to the question, right? Sure. The term.
Evangelical Christianity, historically, according to all kinds of scholars, probably begins in the late 17th century. Its origins lie in Baptist dissent in England, Lutheran pietism in Germany, and essentially it's not a church, it's not American, it's not an ideology. It's a renewalist movement that has spread across many churches. There are revivalists or evangelicals in almost every church denomination in every country in the world. We're not talking about anything that has anything specifically to do with the United States. This movement didn't start in the United States. There was no such thing as the United States when evangelicalism began.
So the West.
Yeah.
Well, but Christianity was not originally a Western religion. You had more Christians outside of Europe, in Africa and Asia, during the first 1,000 years of Christianity. So I'm not sure what is gained
Sure,
by...
but the term itself.
In other words, you in your remarks, you wisely said we shouldn't make a conflation between America and Christianity. I agree with you, but you keep doing that in your subsequent remarks.
No, not Christianity. I'm trying to make a very simple point, that there is something unique to a Western evangelical born-again discourse.
Well, can I
that
just-
is not that. Just hold on.
Okay.
This is a political discussion. This is not theology. That is not in its nature organic to the Christian societies in Muslim majority lands that we are now pointing to and saying religious freedom for minorities. Those minorities and their ideology is not specifically what you're pointing to as the litmus test for religious freedom. The litmus test for religious freedom is as many Bibles in Saudi Arabia as you want and full-fledged on the population. If they choose, great. If they don't choose, you have the freedom to practice whatever you want. That's the litmus test that I'm hearing.
It's not the litmus test I've announced. I believe in anything that I've said.
Okay. So what
I specifically said that this has nothing to do with missionaries flooding countries with Bibles. This has to do with whether Coptic Christians, for example, and there's great diversity. I just met with someone who was just in Egypt spending time with Coptic Christians. Increasingly, some Coptic Christians, not all, are identifying themselves with a form of evangelical, charismatic Christianity. Are those Coptic evangelicals, will they be free to invite friends to accept their version of the faith or not? And if their friends decide that they can, that they want to adopt that form of faith, will they be permitted to do so by the Egyptian government? This has nothing to do with any Americans or any external intervention or money pouring in or anything of that sort.
Okay, let's go to the next question.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What role has and should history play when discussing religious freedom today when we go back to the words of each faith where the sword was used? Both Jesus and the Prophet Muhammad did talk about the sword. Constantine, what he had a vision. The Crusaders, El Cid. It seems like a lot of this is neglected in American history, and I'm curious. It seems like it may have a little more prominent role in Islamic history.
Case.
No, you kind of answered the question in your question, and that is each faith has had its tradition, if you want to use that term loosely, of spreading its faith and its dominion, political in this instance, often through violent means, and that. If you want to say who's right, who's wrong, I would say that's wrong. Whether it was the Catholic Spanish going into South America in search of gold, but also spreading, forcing the indigenous Indians to accept the Catholic faith or to die, and likewise in the instances where Muslim armies went into countries. But what I'll say is again that there is a differentiation between practice, and I would never say that what the Inquisitors did in Spain, it was ever reflective of the words and teachings of Jesus Christ, nor would I argue that what some do in the name of Islam, even to this day, is reflective of the words and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or what I've read as a Muslim and been taught as a Muslim in the Quran. So that's important to make sure that we have authentic voices, whatever the faith tradition. But you also point out, again, that there is the political to borrow the phrase that there's two sides of the sword, and that is there is a political and the religious, and that was the context. It was a political, and we're living with that today. And the last factor I didn't add is that there is in some Muslim majority countries an inferiority complex. And you hear that in many conversations. The West in general has superseded in wealth and in power the majority Muslim countries. For some, they long to restore the power and grandeur of the Muslim empires. And there is an inferiority complex there that if you allow the growth of Christianity, that you will admit the inferiority of the Muslim culture and Muslim religion. And that's wrong. But that, again, that should be pointed out and be recognized.
We probably need a panel to do religion and violence, and I think it takes us off of our questions on religious freedom, so
I would
could
say
be brief.
The question about history, though, in a certain sense, levels the field because I think neither faith has both faiths have parts of their history that don't reflect upon the ideals that they support. And I think also this idea of history, though, is helpful. Getting back to Ahmed's comments about this seems, to his perspective, seems to be a new movement within Christian communities that normally wouldn't be proselytizing. But at some time, every community was proselytizing. At some point, Islam was new to Northern Africa as it came out of the Arabian Peninsula. So, it's about freedom of conscience and the ability to people to decide very personal issues freely. And the funny thing, or the interesting thing about converts in countries where it's illegal, it's a victimless crime. I mean, the person who's converted and who has, the law has been trying to protect is happier because they've had this experience and decided to make a very personal decision to join a different religious community. So where's the victim? Who is the law trying to protect? Well, it's not the individual, because the individual freely made that choice to join a different faith.
Let's take the next question.
Yeah, this follows up on this apostasy question. I think it keeps coming up for a reason, because for many of us, the very notion that there should be legal sanctions and discrimination and punishment and in many cases, ultimate sanction of death for somebody. Not in Muslim majority countries, it's okay if you convert to be a Muslim, but if you convert to be a Muslim to a Christian or something else, then you're subject to all these legal sanctions. For many of us, that is a gross violation of human rights and a gross act of social injustice, right? Now, by your face, you may not believe that. You've been saying it's wrong to do that. And when I said it's a social injustice to do this, you reacted. So I'd like to hear, first question is, do you think that that is a social injustice? And then the second question is, one hears this a lot, that, yeah, they persecute and discriminate against those who convert to another religion other than Islam, but it's the result of colonialism. It's an inferiority complex. But what a lot of people who look at this want to question whether, in fact, it actually goes deeper. And now we're starting to get the crux of the controversy. Because if you go back prior to the colonial era, the argument is made, no, the notion under canonical views of Sharia law also had sanctions from the very beginning against those who would convert from being Muslims to being Christians or Jews or some other religion. So it's the argument would be it is right there in the DNA of canonical Islam, and it cannot be pegged on more recent notions of colonialism, inferiority complex, et cetera. So I wonder if you all would take on those two questions. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me be very clear. I mean, I believe that every man should be able to practice any religion they believe in, and they should be able to do that in any land that exists. And if you knew me when I was like 5 years ago running a Muslim organization, you wouldn't dare think that I was up here defending lack of religious freedom in Muslim majority societies. So where I come from, it's very clear. These issues are very clear. But again, I mean, my discomfort is with all of a sudden, I mean, I remember when I was studying international law, and every time I went to somebody and said international law, they looked at me like, there is no such thing as international law. What are you talking about? And all of a sudden, these things that merely rise to the level of customary international law, like the Human Rights Declaration, it's been mentioned 5 times in the room. I love that. I think that's absolutely wonderful. But how consistent are we in these, in our respect of public international law and the institutions it's created? I mean, let's take a poll. How many people here believe that American soldiers should be subject to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court? That's not a majority of the people here. I would be one of those people. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, what you're seeing in my face is a kid that studied international law, that wrote about international law, that tried to do everything he possibly could, including working for Sergio de Mello, God rest his soul, when he was representing the UN in Iraq. And then all of a sudden, everybody's all about international law, and I'm the guy defending lack of religious freedom. I mean, no way. That equation just doesn't make sense to me. But should every man practice the religion they believe is truth and pursue the Lord in the way they want to pursue the Lord? Absolutely. Does the world exist of principles in a vacuum? No. There are very real consideration for these societies that are inhibiting the religious freedom of different people. And I am saying a very simple thing. Every man should be free to practice what they believe, but don't continue to take me to the level of principle in conversations that are about practicalities and socio-political realities that countries are going through. Because in principle, I can tell you, in principle, a young Muslim man, we should have 15 Muslim congressmen. But we don't. In principle, there are a lot of things that should be happening here at home before we bring about. In principle, black folk and white folk should be equal in America. In principle, men and women should get equal pay for equal work in America. In principle, find me a black person in America that believes that's the case. So that's all I'm saying. Let's deal with the level of reality and practicality.
We're getting that's a minute. No, wait a minute. We're getting close to the end, and I want everyone who's lined up at least to say their question. So let's have that. Each of you address your questions, just one after the next, and then we'll allow each of you to make some final comment for the panel. And I think we might be able to finish a little bit after 3 by then. Yes.
Okay, a few responses to things that Mr. Younis said.
Not responses. Let's have a question.
All right, fine. You said that we should, that these Muslim-majority countries can afford to abandon principle just for pragmatism. But when there's a direct Quranic directive supporting religious freedom, I don't see how that can be ignored when these governments claim some sort of Islamic justification for their legitimacy. And that directive is...
That's a very good point, but there's a clear Islamic... No, this is a very important point. You're absolutely right.
It is an important point,
right.
and you'll be able to comment on it at the end, all right? Next question. You'll get...
all right.
Relax, Ahmed.
Oppression, man. The Muslims.
Just wait. Just wait. You're going to get 6 Supreme Court justices if you wait.
Okay. Okay. Basically, I just didn't get, what's the solution. And I didn't agree with anybody on the panel because my take is this. We came here 400 years ago because we were exiled because we chose not to be loyal to the national religion. To this day, my family, the evangelical majority, has fought in every conflict of the United States of America on foreign soil. However, we were also framers of the national and state constitution of the mid-16th century regime. However, legislation today has adapted it that does not wholly protect trade and religious freedom of the American people. Meanwhile, domestic issues are on the back burner while Americans are persecuted in Muslim countries. So I'm saying, what is the solution? Because as an American, I don't feel like, I can go to a foreign country and have trade or religious freedom. And I can't, it's an airplane, I can't do one without the other. Now, I have a solution, but I would just I would pull all Americans out of Muslim countries and I wouldn't offer any foreign aid to rogue nations.
Thank you. All right, next question.
My question is regarding born again. I have a little problem with that. We're talking about problems with Muslims and Christians. But there's a problem within the Christian faith itself, Protestant and Catholic and Jews. And that problem is with this born again. It's like we have a past, but we're supposed to leave it behind because we're born again. And then all of a sudden we go around with this high and mighty attitude and we judge everybody else according to my being born again.
All right. So your question.
That's my question.
Your comment. Okay.
Yeah, it's this born again. What really is?
We have a few interior Christian issues too. Yeah. Right. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I have 2 questions. And one, why is it that the U.S. judiciary system have allowed the removal of religious symbols such as prayer at school, public and private, and the removal of symbols such as the Ten Commandments, targeting the U.S. dollars to this day from the American, which is supposed to be the land of the free? And my second question, can this panel do something to differentiate and disassociate the judicial system of the United States to stop its interference into religious freedom?
Okay, so you've got a series of questions. We're going to go in the order on the panel. So Suhail,
Well,
you got a minute.
I got a minute, so I'll be quick. First, before I forget, I want to thank everybody for the robust conversation, and I hope you'll forgive all of us if we say anything incorrect. But two things: the Islamic principle, and this goes to the previous question. Again, I wanted to point out the historical realities, not as excuses, but just as realities, so that we know what context we're talking about when we're talking about religious freedom in some Muslim-majority countries. So I'm not excusing any of the laws on the books or the behaviors of Muslims. I don't have the ability to excuse it, first of all, and nobody's asking me to, but I also wanted to make sure that that was understood. There is no compulsion in religion. That is the Islamic injunction when it comes to faith. And there are other verses in the Holy Quran and the text that say that we worship what we worship and you worship what you worship, and in that is something that is the respect and the reconciliation in each, and that is the Islamic principle. And I'll end with the solution, and the solution was asked for, and that is that we should engage with Muslim-majority countries with respect and work what we call in a bottom-up and a top-down approach, where we work in a much more respectful way to promote religious freedom without what our president of IG will point out, shame, blame, and name, shame, and blame, and that is trying to point our finger and trying to, in a way, say, look, you're wrong, we're right, and we're going to teach you how you're wrong.
Okay, good. Timothy, a minute and a half.
This has been not only an honest conversation, but a fun conversation. I thank Ahmed and Suhail and Knox for being a part of it with me. I wanted to say that I strongly believe that Islam as a faith community, as a tradition, would benefit enormously from what we call, from our own constitutional tradition, disestablishment. And I want to emphasize that in many of the regimes where there are religious freedom problems, it is first and foremost the Islamic faith that is under the boot of oppressive, in some cases, secularist regimes. Turkey is an excellent example. In Turkey, Islam as a whole is controlled by the Diyanet, the Religious Affairs Bureau. Every Friday, imams in Turkey are told what to preach and what not to preach. And so it's first and foremost, in many of the countries that we've been talking about, Islam that is being oppressed, that is being ossified, that is being prevented from having a more vigorous debate. I certainly agree with Ahmed. He's absolutely right. We shouldn't portray these societies as static, as undynamic, stuck in some sort of traditionalist backwater. They are very dynamic. There's great discourse and vigorous debate. I just believe that the disestablishment of religion in Muslim countries, just as we have enjoyed it imperfectly in the United States, would go a long way towards making the debate in the Muslim world even more vigorous, would go a long way towards enabling Muslims to have the dignity and the freedom to choose their way of life in the way that I believe God wants them to have.
Good. Knox?
Again, thank you for inviting me. And I guess the question that comes to mind, being a practical-minded person, so what's next? Where do we go from here? And as a religious freedom advocate, it would be, I think, a great benefit to people of all faiths if Muslims and Christians could start advocating for the religious freedoms of the other. And in fact, I first talked to Suhail on the phone a year and a half ago when a Muslim in Afghanistan was sentenced to death for questioning the role of women in an Islamic society. And I was at the State Department at the time, and I knew the United States speaking out on this would just be the worst thing that could be done for this young man. And are there American Muslim organizations that could speak out against this into their own community? And at the time, there didn't seem to be, the Muslim American community wasn't positioned to work internationally on religious freedom issues. And I think that the development of that would be a tremendous benefit to the religious freedom community and the ability to promote this fundamental human right for all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Ahmed.
very much. Everybody on this panel is actually a friend of mine. First time me and Tim meet each other, but it's an honor to be with you. I'll make 3 points very quickly and close. The sister that said the point about the Quran says that there should be religious freedom, and how is it that these people are not following what the Quran says? I mean, the Quran is also very clear about equality between men and women. The Quran is also very clear about Muslim nations that have overwhelming amounts of wealth and Muslim nations that don't have bread for the children on the streets. I mean, what Western Muslims have been doing, I've been in what is called the American Muslim community since I was 13 years old. What we've been doing this whole time is simply trying to tell Muslims globally and Muslim governments globally, this is what the Quran and the Prophet say you're supposed to be doing, and this is where you're off base. Like American Muslims were barking about Afghanistan and the Taliban way before the public discourse knew what a Taliban was or what Afghanistan is or where it is on the map. So yes, Muslims should be measured to that standard, and there is no higher standard than that standard. And investigate it and you will see how like it is to the standards that we bring upon ourselves as Americans. Number two, this issue of disestablishment. There is no church in Islam that can disestablish itself from the Islamic State. And so even the conversation about change has to embrace a different discourse, a discourse that's organic to Islamic intellectual thought and the structures of Sharia and how you go about changing that through ijtihad. So that's a conference all on its own. The last thing I would say is, maybe this is a moment where we don't focus on religious freedom as the hot button issue. Maybe this is a moment where we embrace the president's invocation of a paradigm of mutual respect and mutual interests. There is so much in common between the interests that Muslims are looking for and are interested in and the interests of America in their lands and in the West, and the respect that both sides are looking for than there is on the issue of women or the issue of development or the issue of literacy or the issue of religious freedom. Is this an important issue? It absolutely is. But there are moments in history and in the interchange between peoples where you have to choose your battle. And I'm just humbly suggesting, as somebody that believes everyone should be free to choose their religion, this might not be the battle that we choose right now in America's relationship with Muslims globally.
All right, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much. We very much enjoyed the presentations, the give and take. You can certainly say we are at the beginning. We are at the beginning, and that's encouraging. We have more to go, and we'll be working together. Closing words, my colleague John Esposito, and is Chris Seipel also coming up? No. All right, John Esposito.
Okay, just 2 points. One, I think that it's always good to contextualize things historically. The fact is that when we talk about notions of disestablishment, when we talk about the way in which religion was disestablished in the U.S., when we talk about the evangelical legacy and other Christian groups, they were in fact minorities who were persecuted by more majority mainstream religious groups. And so in many ways it was in their own self-interest to move for what they wanted. You look at Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism was the last religious tradition, not last, but the last major Christian tradition to accept religious pluralism. That didn't happen until Vatican II. Why? Because American Catholics had to deal with minority status. And that got into a whole redefinition of what it meant when a religion had to deal with what do we do when we have permanent minority groups. The problem, though, is that in contemporary times, we see often that minorities still have a sense when they come to power, sectors of them, with wanting to kind of influence or control. So, for example, if you look at Gallup data, more than 50% of American Christians say that our laws should be based on the Bible and that religious leaders should be involved in that process. Now, what does that say about disestablishment? What does that say to non-Christians in terms of their attitude? On the Muslim side, I think what Muslims are doing is going through, in many ways, what historically other traditions have gone through. Not the exact same pattern. That is, having defined a religion as a religion for majorities, you now have more Muslim minority permanent communities than ever existed, and it's in a world that has had a sea change from previous time to today, and therefore you see a redefinition occurring within Islam. But I think that there are causes of concern on both sides. We have causes, those of us who are Christian, when we hear militant Muslim preachers saying what they're doing or what some governments are doing. But there are Muslims who are concerned that after we went into Iraq, that is the U.S., you had Christian missionaries, you look at Time magazine talking about it, seeing President Bush as having opened up Afghanistan and Iraq as part of God's way to bring the Christian mission. On the other hand, you have local Christians saying, we've been here for several thousand years. You guys are young, and implied in your desire to mission is looking down or not even being aware of our faith, plus also being concerned about, in line with what was said earlier, about the whole idea that still this is another form of colonialism, of Christian spreading colonialism. So I think our faiths are still in this kind of, awkward situation, because I think we're still working with legacies. And if you look at the last 15 years, you will see that Christianity in all forms, Protestantism and Catholicism, as in Islam, in becoming more robust, I just love that word because it's an in word, in fact often falls back on more fundamentalist and conservative sort of worldviews. Problem with that is that often conservative, very conservative and fundamentalist worldviews are more exclusive than inclusive. I'd like to end by thanking all the panelists today and the audience for making this a day of both reaching out and of robust conversation. Thank you very much.